Welcome to the Near Memo, a weekly conversation about search, social, and commerce. What happened, why it matters, and the implications for local.
Before we move on to David, who wants to talk about the Yelp report and what, it purports to say one thing, but David, you think it says something else. What is the report?
Sure. So this was again, I think it was titled, I'm looking for the exact title, Remote Work Report, How the Pandemic Has Reshaped Local Economies and How We Work. Well, come to find out that the primary sort of takeaway bullet that Yelp leads with as the main takeaway has nothing to do with remote work. It has to do with the share of searches happening in given markets across the country. So their sort of theory of the case in terms of why this is happening is that, so many people have moved to these remote markets and away from urban centers that the percentage of searches in South Dakota was their, I think, number one sort of region in which the share of searches increased. That's all these people are moving to less populated, cheaper areas, and that's driving a shift in sort of consumer behavior. They also make a really important qualifier, which I think could explain 90% of their data, that they assume that tourism has remained the same in each of these locations. So they found that, again, that these sort of more rural, sort of intermountain Western states and Great Plains states were the states that saw the largest percentage in the share of searches that were happening on Yelp. And that the major urban centers on the West Coast, as well as some of the ones in the Northeast, had seen the largest drop in search share. And to me, there's a much simpler explanation than, a bunch of people have moved to North Dakota and South Dakota because they're great places to live during the pandemic, is just that Yelp's general market share is declining in urban centers, that urbanites aren't using Yelp as much. And we know, at least in Portland, I think it's true in the Bay Area as well, that tourism is definitely down to Portland relative to pre-pandemic levels. And so you just don't have as many people who don't know as much about their cities that they're visiting doing searches. And, just from my standpoint, not that I was a heavy Yelp user even before the pandemic, but, I know the places that are in my city pretty well. And so generally my queries are to Google primarily, and in some cases, Apple Maps. Generally my queries are recovery searches where I know the business I'm looking for and I want to see if they're open or if they have, if they have live TV to watch a Blazer game or whatever. So I just don't see that the Yelp's takeaway is anything close to the most logical, simplest explanation. They're really, in some cases, I think maybe trying to hide the just a decline in market share in some of their most important markets, where I'm guessing most of their advertising dollars come from these big urban centers where they can actually charge a significant premium to the folks advertising.
To just reinforce your point, David, if you in the 10K, buried in the 10K are two facts that support your argument. One is that their review corpus growth has declined yet again. It's not, it's still small growth, like 3%. And their overall traffic numbers have declined yet again, I think mostly due to desktop declines, and the increases in apps usage didn't make up for the desktop and mobile declines. So I think that their 10K reinforces your point that largely it reflects a declining relevance and
particularly in urban markets, right? Even if the urban market usage, declined 2%, that's going to make, by default, South Dakota and North Dakota, which I assume had very small search shares before that, it's going to make them look like they grew that much more. So,
right. I mean, rural use of Yelp has always been very light. I mean, it's always been.
And West Virginia, I should say, was the third sort of biggest popping state. So you're talking about very rural states which historically have not had heavy Yelp usage, being the most substantial increases.
Right. On a percentage basis, the growth is coming from a much smaller base, and so the percentage can look larger. I mean, to say something perhaps in Yelp's defense, there's other data that suggests, people have moved out of urban centers to varying degrees. There was a piece of of data that I saw. I think this was U.S. government data that was talking about the daytime. Mike, you might have sent this.
Yes, it was Census Bureau analysis of daytime traffic to urban centers.
Right. So what it said is that remote work had shifted the concentrations of people in the daytime out of the downtown core and to other places in cities. So they're directionally, what Yelp is saying is probably accurate, but the numbers themselves may be reflective of a decline in Yelp usage more than they are larger.
And my
US
understanding of the
demographic
phenomenon is not so
patterns.
much, however, that that traffic, however you want to define digital or real world traffic, has moved out of urban centers to other states. It's that they've moved out of urban centers to either suburbs, exurbs, or more rural areas in the same state.
Yes.
So that wouldn't make
Yes,
sense. I mean,
right.
that explanation would not actually solve Yelp's sort of dilemma of, people in Oregon, for example, have definitely moved out of Portland for daytime working hours, but they're now working in Beaverton or Hillsborough or Bend, not so much in downtown Portland. The traffic in Oregon should still be flat or rising, I would think, if that was happening. So in the
aggregate, I mean, that's the same is true in California. So, there's a lot of reports about thousands of people have migrated out of San Francisco, et cetera, but most of the people that left high cost of living areas have moved within the state to more affordable areas. So people moving to Sacramento, to inland a little bit, people moving to the greater San Diego area, which is not so affordable, but nonetheless cheaper than other places. So, it's we got to be really careful with the conclusions that we draw from this information. But Yelp's revenues were up.
Because they're releasing better products at this point. I mean, they've got some real SaaS products that provide value, and things like, getting a quote on, directly from a Yelp profile. Like, that's the weird thing. It's like, finally Yelp seems to have a somewhat cohesive, actually beneficial to their customer product strategy. And yet, it's probably 5 or 8 years too late, given the sort of erosion in their market share from a consumer standpoint. So.
There still is one gangster product that I dislike, which is to get ads removed from your listing, you pay a fee. Otherwise, there's going to be competitor ads on your listing.
Well, that's the logic
in their defense,
of the market.
Not
right?
Yelp's
That's
biggest defender here, but in their defense, ads are appearing on Google business profiles left and right these days, and there's no way to get rid of them, even if you wanted to pay Google. So
that's true. So
exactly.
Yelp becomes a hero.
At least they provide one
context,
outlet here, even if it costs money.
Which company is less of a gangster? Oh,
well, that's
quite a comparison.
We'll invite Luther Lowe and Kent Walker to debate that very point.
Yes. Okay. No defamatory remarks about
that's their job is to defend the positions of their companies. So
it's difficult
to defend the indefensible.
Right. Well, I mean, we're not going to talk about privacy, but that you're obliquely referring to Kent Walker's recent blog post defending sort of Google's position on a national privacy law, which sounds good on the surface, but is really advocating for a weakening or dilution of local laws like the California Consumer Privacy Act and CPRA, its successor, that provide more stringent.
And I think importantly, Google is trying to minimize its lobbying expenses. If we have 50 states each coming up with their own privacy laws, Google's going to have to spend in every state senate, as opposed to buying off 100 United States senators to get particular provisions removed or added. So.
Well, right. And there are examples. I mean, we're not talking about privacy, but there are examples of really weak state laws, like Virginia is one of those. And then there are stronger state laws. I don't blame them for wanting a uniform law. I mean, it's a headache to try and comply with 50 different privacy laws, which all have different nuances and requirements. But, the answer is a strong, transparent consumer privacy data protection law at the national level, not something that looks like a good law, but really isn't, and it's sort of business as usual. But
Thanks for joining David, Mike, and Greg. To stay on top of the latest developments in local, subscribe to our newsletter at nearmedia.co. We'll see you next week.